They have now spoken on the phone, but that doesn't mean Barack Obama and Benjamin Netanyahu have mended fences. In fact, now comes word U.S. House Speaker John Boehner will travel to Israel before the end of the month. The visit will follow Netanyahu's surprise re-election and that speech to Congress at the start of the month on the invitation of the Republican leader of the House, an event that aggravated the White House and drew sharp criticism.
Relations between the US Obama administration and Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu have always been tense. Comments the Israeli premier made in his hardline re-election campaign seem to have downgraded them further.
What is apparent is that in the context of the campaign, and while he was the sitting Prime Minister of Israel, he walked back from commitments that Israel had previously made to a two-state solution.
Netanyahu's campaign led to the US saying it would have to reassess its policies regarding the resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The Israeli leader appeared on US television on Thursday, seeming to backtrack on his rejection of a two-state solution and reasserting the strong ties between his country and the US.
We're allies. We have to consult each other, not have fiats or unilateral imposition, but negotiated peace with our neighbors and support between allies. And America has no greater ally than Israel, and Israel has no greater ally than the United States.
After 2 days of silence, US President Barack Obama eventually called Netanyahu to congratulate him on his election win, but the overall message was not friendly. Despite Netanyahu's climb down, the US could withdraw its unwavering support for Israel at the UN. So far, Washington successfully blocked any Security Council resolutions against Israel. Meanwhile, the US says direct talks are still the best way to reach peace if the Israeli Prime Minister is willing to negotiate.
If he's willing to negotiate, let's pick up on that point with Matt DUSS. He's the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. He joins us from Washington. Many thanks for being with us here on France 24. Before I ask you about John Boehner's trip, at this point, should we just say that the prospect of Middle East peace talks is dead in the water for a long time to come?
Well, I think under a Netanyahu prime ministership, I think it's very safe to say. Whatever Netanyahu might say now after having rejected once again the two-state solution earlier this week, and it's worth noting that this was simply a return to a position he'd held for the majority of his career. Whatever he might say now, I think he has demonstrated through his actions, more importantly than words, of course, his actions over the past several years, that he simply does not support the creation of a Palestinian state and will continue to do everything in his power to undermine that possibility. So I think the United States, while it still maintains that bilateral negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians are the best route to achieving a two-state solution, for now that route is shut because of the recalcitrance of the Israeli government. And so the U.S. is going to be looking at other options to advance toward that goal.
And this announcement that John Boehner is going to Israel before the end of the month, your thoughts on that? Is that simply going to be another nail in the coffin in the relationship between Netanyahu and Obama?
Well, I think what it does show is that this issue, the U.S.-Israel relationship, is going to be increasingly debated on a much more partisan basis. This is something that has been developing over the past several years. It really reached a new level with the invitation by Boehner to Netanyahu to address the Congress, something that was engineered very quietly behind the scenes between Speaker Boehner and the Israeli ambassador to the U.S., Ron Dermer, himself part of a Republican family in the United States. So I think we're going to be seeing more of this. And it is worth noting that we have to understand how some of the frankly racist appeals that were made by Netanyahu to his voters to get his voters to the polls. For Boehner, now without any criticism or any acknowledgement of the ugliness of that campaign style, to reward Netanyahu with a visit to Israel, I think that shows that there's very little that Netanyahu can do to hurt that relationship. So yeah, I think this is going to be much more of a Republican versus Democrats thing in the future.
And you add to that, top Obama administration official is going to be addressing the pro-peace lobby, J Street in Washington. The partisan genie is out of the bottle for good when it comes to U.S.-Israel relations?
I don't know if I would say it's out of the bottle for good. I think under Netanyahu, who has very, very energetically and aggressively tried to make this a partisan issue. He's someone who's much more closely allied with the Republican Party and someone who has clearly not respected the kind of boundaries that previous prime ministers have respected when it comes to essentially campaigning for one side versus the other in U.S. politics. We saw this in 2012 when he essentially came out and all but endorsed Mitt Romney for president against Obama. So yeah, I think as long as Netanyahu is in power, it's going to get worse, not better.
And which way is the White House really going? Let me ask you this question, Matt. On the one hand, you have the White House spokesman dangling the prospect of reassessing, those were his words, the U.S.'s position when it comes to vetoing sanctions against Israel at the United Nations. On the other hand, Obama still takes Netanyahu on the phone.
Of course, I think it is, let's recognize that the U.S.-Israel strategic relationship is not going to change drastically anytime soon. It is very deeply rooted. The U.S. and Israel do have some key interests in common. There are strong relationships in not only politically, diplomatically, but also culturally. So I think that relationship will continue. However, as I said earlier, I think the U.S. is seriously reassessing its actions, particularly with regard to the goal of a two-state solution. So I think we will see, and the U.S. has been going in this direction for some time.
But do you see it as an empty threat when they talk about reassessing their view when it comes to the United Nations?
Well, I think it's all relative. I think, the U.S. has been a strong supporter, almost unquestioning, for many years. I think that will change. But I think the U.S. finally supporting some action at the UN, whether regarding a framework plan, a U.S. position, or simply an affirmation of the two-state goal with some parameters, 67 lines with swaps, as President Obama himself has articulated. This is something obviously Israel and certainly Netanyahu does not want because he doesn't share that goal, but also because UN action against Israel and against any country is something any country would probably oppose. But I think we are going to see movement in that direction. This is something members of the administration have been hinting at for some time. If Israel would not show that it is serious about negotiating a two-state solution, as the government of Netanyahu has clearly shown now, then there are other options that the U.S. has to consider, and they are now seriously considering them.
Is time on Netanyahu's side? He knows the Obama administration has less than 2 years to run.
Well, I think it is in some respects, because everyone recognizes, the U.S. and the Palestinians as well as others, that eventually the way you cannot deal with this issue finally and permanently through the UN. This has to be dealt bilaterally by Israelis and Palestinians signing a final agreement for the creation of two states. But what can be done at the UN is to reaffirm that goal, to create certain costs and consequences for Israel that they have not had to bear up until now. So I think the hope is by making those consequences clear and moving toward possibly even sanctions on settlements, once those costs become apparent and begin to be felt by Israelis, they might take a different view toward a government that acts so recalcitrantly as Netanyahu has.
All right, so watch whether or not there's more pressure applied when it comes to Jewish settlements in the occupied territories. I want to thank you, Matt DUSS, for joining us from Washington. Matt DUSS of the Foundation for Middle East Peace.